After the disabled god of war marries me as a concubine. Author, Lu Guhua. Copywriting, in Yeshiji, the beam war Hua Wuju was once captured by an enemy country. In order to humiliate him, Na Hunjun rewarded him to his broken sleeve emperor brother as a concubine. General Huo suffered all the humiliation, and he tried his best for 3 years. After that, Jin Chan escaped from his shell and sneaked back to the scene. After healed the leg problems, he led his army into the capital of the enemy country for 3 months, killed its king, burned its capital, and finally beheaded the head with broken sleeves and hung it on the wall for 3 full years. Since then, the world has ruled. Zhang Suizhu, a tutor in the history department of a university, received a graduation thesis based on Hua Wuju's unconventional history and criticized the students. When he opened his eyes again, he became the prince with broken sleeves in the wild history. The lanterns and festoons were all around, and someone came to report that the disabled general of the enemy country had been carried into the palace by the sedan chair. Facing General Huo, who was dying tortured, wore a red wedding gown, and had a gloomy look, Zhang Suizhu knew that the wild history would also come true. It will also allow him to be shown to the public by the owl, with his head hanging on the wall for 3 years. Zhang Suizhu had to donate General Huo house hung. He shot a spear and a secret arrow in the center, humiliating the king in every possible way. He gritted his teeth to stop him, hoping that after 3 years, he could keep his own head. Even more dare not really let this 9-foot-long concubine wait on him. But in less than 3 years, General Huo's legs healed. Not only did he kill Wu Jun and unified the world, he also climbed onto his bed, his eyes were fierce, and he was pressed tightly in the tent, insisting on doing his concubine duty. Edible Guide * Daily Update, update at 9 o'clock every night, other time updates are in revision. * Welcome to catch bugs, welcome to point out the problems and mistakes in the article, but don't quarrel, don't scold others. * Temporarily gone. Content tag, Strong and Strong Palace Marquee wears books above the court. Search keywords, protagonist, Zhang Suizhu, Hua Wuju supporting role. Others, 1-sentence introduction, in order to save our lives, God of War and I first married and then loved. Purpose, don't give up the hope of life in a desperate situation. VIP strong push medal. According to the records of wild history, Hua Wuju, the of war, was once captured by the enemy. After receiving a graduation thesis based on Hua Wuju's unofficial history, Zhang Suizhu, a tutor in the history department of a university, wore it into the unofficial history to marry and humiliate Hua Wuju's prince of broken sleeve. Facing General Huo, who was dying tortured, wore a red wedding gown, and had a gloomy look, Zhang Suizhu knew that the wild history would also come true. He had no choice but to offer General Huo house hung, but after less than 3 years, General Huo's legs healed. This article is fluent in writing, delicate in emotional description, and good in plot writing. It tells the story of the 2 protagonists in the turbulent last dynasty, fighting together against monarchs and officials, and gradually knowing and falling in love amidst numerous difficulties. The images of the 2 protagonists are full and lively, their emotions are smooth and moving, the storyline is ups and downs, and the meticulous depiction of the small characters is a fascinating and worthy masterpiece. As the night falls, the stars and rivers turn. Red silk and lanterns were hung in the Jingwang mansion in the middle of King Hefeng early in the morning. When the sky darkened, the lights were turned on immediately, and from a distance, there was a bright golden red. The small servants busy entering and exiting at the door and the thick layer of firecracker fragments in front of the steps were all illuminated with a lively joy. When the soft wind blows in the early spring of the south of the Yangtze River, the red candle in the lantern flickers, swaying the happy characters on the lantern. There is a happy event in the Jing Palace, which is today. The 3rd day of February is an auspicious day appointed by the Holy Spirit. The Emperor said that on February 3rd, everything is suitable, especially suitable for marriage. As for whether this day is really auspicious, it does not matter. The important thing is that the Emperor insists on letting King Jing marry on this day. Even if there is a funeral in Prince Jing's mansion on this day, he must put the coffin aside and marry that person into the door with blows and blows. The emperor's words are powerful enough, just as it is. Even if this emperor was killed by rebels into the capital city of Yuchen 2 years ago, he led Begwan to the south and fled south in embarrassment like a dog in the water, and ran to Yuhang to survive. However, the emperor who resembles the bereaved dog is also the emperor. What's more, the emperor only won a big victory a few days ago, and now it is the time for Chun Feng to be proud and full of ambition. After all, no one in the world knows, the invincible and frightening General Huo of Saint Admiral Bai Liang caught him and broke his legs. It is indeed a happy event. There are joys in the grand scene, and so are the palaces of Jing. But this double happiness came to the gate of the Jing Palace, but everyone in the Jing Palace was not happy, but they were all like mourning concubines. After all, it's common for other generals to catch them, to kill or pluck them. However, wrap the general in a wedding dress and marry them to the Jing Palace to be a concubine, what a thing! Therefore, although the Jing Palace was blown and beaten, the lanterns were decorated, and the firecrackers were set off for most of the day, none of the people in the palace had a smile on their faces. Everyone was busy coming and going, watching the excitement, but each tacitly lowered their eyebrows and dared not speak. This kind of silence spreading in joy made the atmosphere in the palace somewhat depressing. The more you go in, the more dull the atmosphere becomes. Especially in Yintang. The Enyan Hall is the place where His Highness King Jing lives. The word Enyan is the name given by the master in the palace from the Lotus Sutra of wonderful Dharma for him. This is not surprising, after all, His Royal Highness King Jing was sick and weak from the womb, and his body has never been healthy. To be able to live so ill and crookedly till now, it can be considered a bit of Buddha's light. There was a brilliantly illuminated silence in Enyan Hall at this time. The entire palace was hung with red silk, but there was no half of it in the Enyan Hall. Under the curtain of night, the courtyard was bright with candles, and the warm wind was blowing. Several tall, century-old pear trees spread the white flowers on the ground in the wind. The maids in the courtyard went in and out, watching their noses and noses, but they dare not come out. Everyone knows that the prince is in a bad mood today. The prince said few words in the day, and he rarely smiled. He always looked somber, which made people feel unpredictable and could not guess what he was thinking. Today it is even worse. Even if he wants to come, although the prince has a habit of breaking his sleeves, he is not a person who is not afraid of meat and vegetables. Where can the enemy's generals be crippled and rewarded to the princes as children? Regardless of how dangerous this person is, like a trapped beast, the emperor's imperial decree is extremely absurd, and it is simply a sacred decree that writes humiliating words and hits the prince on the face. So the prince is in a bad mood as it should be. These servants have to be careful not to be touched or lose their heads at this time. The room became quiet. Because he married a concubine, the prince did not need to welcome him personally, but the bridal chamber was required. Therefore, His Royal Highness King Jing packed up early, put on a golden red wedding gown, and tied the ink hair into the jade crown. He is sitting on the couch, holding a book in one hand. The descendants stood silently on the side, no one dared to disturb him. A little maid who was serving in the courtyard walked in cautiously. She got the foreman's order to come in and take the basin of water next to the dressing table. She lowered her head, her eyes did not dare to look randomly, and she clasped her hands in front of her. The atmosphere in the courtyard was depressing enough, but I didn't expect it to be even worse in the prince's room. The agar wood burns quietly in the furnace, the furnishings are ancient and solemn, and the lamps are as bright as daylight. Obviously, it should be a peaceful and quiet place, but it seemed to be an overcast dungeon surrounded by demons, which made her legs tremble with fear. She tried her best not to make a sound, and silently bowed to the prince on the couch, and quickly went to the copper basin on the ground. But because she doesn't always enter the house to serve, she is not proficient. When I got up with the pot, the edge of the pot accidentally hit the edge of the ebony wooden table, and there was a muffled noise, and a little water splashed out. With a thud, it broke the deadly calm. The little maid shook her hand, her whole body was tense, and she hurriedly raised her eyes to look at the master on the couch. She saw that the prince raised his eyes quietly falling on her. How beautiful are those eyes! The shape is long and narrow, the tail of the eyes is slightly raised lazily, and the eyelashes are long, and there are long eyebrows that are slightly raised, lazy and deceptive, like the eloquent and fascinating demon in the book. There was a small scarlet mole on the end of such a beautiful eye. With the flickering of the lights, I almost took away the souls of people. But the little maid was cold all over. Those eyes were so dark that they couldn't see the bottom, and under the bright colors, they were arrogant and cold, as if they were looking at a dead thing. She knelt on the ground with a weak leg, and the copper basin fell to the ground with a bang, splashing water on the ground. Jiang Suizhu waved his hand stiffly, motioning the little girl to go down. She seemed to have received an amnesty, and kept kowtow to him apologizing, then picked up the wet copper basin on the ground and stumbled away. Jiang Suizhu looked at her back in embarrassment, a little bewildered in his heart. Who am I? So scary? However, he categorically did not dare to ask. Naturally, no one could explain it. He remembered that he just finished replying to the student's message and turned off the computer to go to rest. For him, this was just an extremely ordinary day except for the paper he received today, it was a bit too amateurish. After all, he has been a lecturer at J University for several years and has brought graduates. He has seen all kinds of bizarre essays. He thinks he is well informed. When facing the students, he can always calm down and deal with it freely. Maintain kind eyebrows. But it was the first time he saw a history student, based on the unofficial history, to write the essay like a storytelling with ups and downs and full of emotions. He wrote that it is unspeakable that the founding general of the Liang dynasty and the Dingbei Hohuo Wujiao led the soldiers to destroy the scenery. The reason is that when he was a hostage in Nanjing, he was admitted as a concubine by a sickly prince named Jing and whose name is no longer available in Nanjing. He endured 3 years of humiliation, so he returned to Bai Liang. At that time, the speed of the army was so fast that it was also because of the grudge. Precisely because of this, the King Jing, who died prematurely due to illness with few pens in official history, also died abnormally. He did not die of illness, but was beheaded by Dingbiu. To avenge the revenge of the year, Dingbiu hung his head on the linen city wall for 3 years. Jiang Suizhu felt at the time that this kid, perhaps chosen the wrong major, should be a screenwriter. For their history majors, it is basically a nature to follow Zhuzh to study Qing history. Therefore, Jiang Suizhu criticized the paper mercilessly, and finally gave his own suggestions for revision, change the topic and rewrite the article. That student is also very ambitious. How do you know that the wild history is fake? You can't just say that my thesis is made up just because of this. Even if you study a lot of historical materials, you haven't personally experienced it, you have seen it with your own eyes. After receiving this reply, Jiang Suizhu sneered. I study history, but I have to experience it myself? Then if I study ancient creatures, would I still go into the mountains to be a monkey? He pushed his glasses ruthlessly and replied, it makes sense, but the paper, rewrite. After replying to this sentence, he smiled, rubbed his sore shoulder and neck, and turned off the computer. But at that moment, the surrounding area suddenly became dark. Power cut? But it was dark all around, and there was not even the dim light that usually comes out at night. Jiang Suizhu was stunned, trying to reach out to find the power supply on the table. But before he reached out his hand, it suddenly lit up all around. It's a lamp, but it's jumping and shaking. The lamp illuminates his surroundings. He saw that he was sitting in a room under the warm yellow light. The surrounding furnishings are all made of ancient, partitioned by screens, duobeo pavilion, etc. There is no cave in the sky, elegant and solemn. Although there is no bright color around, and it looks awkward, but the brilliance refracted by those objects has a restrained and solemn luxury. The room was extremely spacious, and there were a lot of maids standing around. At a glance there could be 7 or 8. Jiang Suizhu was a little confused. Hallucinations? He lowered his eyes. At this time, he was actually wearing a bright red robe with wide sleeves. The silk had a precious drape, and the gold silk embroidered with complex moire patterns, gleaming dimly under the lamp. Look at this system, Jing Mo Yang Chu. The book in his hand is printed vertically from right to left, in traditional Song characters. Looking at the ink traces, it is still in the stage of engraving printing. The low table beside him, Huang Huali, and the teacup on the table, he had seen in the museum. Jiang Suizhu's eyes were blank. Who am I? Where am I? How can the things dug out from the ancient graves be on my table? At this moment, the reckless maid made a small noise, which attracted his attention. But as soon as he swept his gaze over, and before thinking about speaking, the little girl who was about 10 years old was so frightened that she fell to her knees, splashed the water on the floor, and kept kowtow. On the contrary, Jiang Suizhu was frightened. He tried to stay calm and raised his hand to signal her to retreat. I saw the little girl holding the basin gratefully and running away. After not running a few steps, she almost slipped by the water under her feet and was hitting the man who came in. What does it look like to be reckless? Get out soon! The man scolded. The voice of the eunuch. Jiang Suizhu raised his eyes to look at him, and saw this man trotting all the way, with a beautiful face and a smile on his face. The smile is very sincere, with 3 points to please. Master! He proficiently bowed in front of Jiang Suizhu, reached his side, bowed and spoke back. The lady's sedan chair has arrived, Master, don't miss the auspicious time. Jiang Suizhu looked at him quietly, and the hand hidden in his sleeve pinched himself severely. If he didn't believe it, he could still pass through suddenly. And, without knowing who I am, we will usher in the bridal chamber anthuriums. The pain spread from the palm of his hand to his central nervous system, and he suddenly felt painful, but the picture in front of him remained unchanged. Even, he seemed to have a cold look because of the pain, and the in front of him trembled with fright. He seems to have become an ancient man somehow. That person should be a princely nobleman, from the last year of the Jing dynasty. As for the other, he didn't know anything about it. Oh, he knows one more thing. That man takes a concubine today. But because he has become him now, the one who takes a concubine has become himself. This is all the information he got, and the smiling in front of him is standing here, waiting for him to enter the bridal chamber. Jiang Suizhu's head is about to explode. What's all this? He was in a hurry, but he didn't show it on his face. The seemed to be anxious, the smile on his face brought a bit of bitterness, he lowered his voice, and his tone became a bitterly consoling. Master, the slave knows that you don't want it, but it is the emperor's decree after all. He persuaded. Even if you don't like it, just go for a cut scene. That person, I heard that martial arts has been abolished long ago, and now he has disabled one. It is very safe. You don't have to worry about it. Abolished people's martial arts and became disabled? Jiang Suizhu's eyes were a little weird. It's still a play of forcible and arrogant. He only knew that in the last years of the Jing dynasty, the court was corrupt, and the emperor was faint, especially the Lord Jinju, who was a notoriously absurd faint emperor. According to historical records, he was addicted to beauty, played a trick with the government, and especially favored his relatives, allowing his uncle Pang Shao to make trouble. However, the Jing dynasty had a few heirs. By the generation of Emperor Jingyu, most of the princes of the same generation died early, but there was only one King Jing who died young. Because of this, Jing Chao fled south for a few years before being destroyed by the rising Liang dynasty. Now it seems, he is also a member of this chaotic and licentious court. Jiang Suizhu's mouth was bitter. What bad things did he do that made him inexplicably change from a comfortable social animal to a prince and nobleman of a doomed dynasty? Is it because the students were a little bit tough just now? How can it be? At this moment, there was a call from outside. "Father Qianshan, the sedan chair has been carried into Ying Kixuan," said the maid. The gritted his teeth and shouted, "What are you urging?" The maid hurriedly closed her voice. The turned his head and looked at Zhang Suizhu eagerly, his eyes full of requests. Zhang Suizhu knew that in this situation, he was bound to face the bridal chamber. However, since the girl I married was not voluntary and has a disability, then this bridal chamber today can be easily fooled. As for other, wait for him to pass today's level, and then slowly figure out his identity and situation, and then make plans. He gave a faint hum and stood up. The eunuch's eyes lit up, and he quickly reached out to help him. Zhang Suizhu is not accustomed to being served like this, but I don't know if it is an illusion. When he stands up, he feels that he is lack of energy, tired, and his head is a little dizzy. He had to let this support him. Walking down the platform, there was a diorama next to it. Zhang Suizhu glanced slightly and saw himself through the mirror. Actually looks exactly the same as himself, only looking at 2 or 3 years younger, he looks only 24-5 years younger. Previously, his students praised him for his good looks and said that he looked good like a villain. Zhang Suizhu originally didn't admit it, but now, looking at the person in the mirror, Zhang Suizhu also feels it's really not like a good person. He was already coldly beautiful, and he looked extremely affectionate. Under the wide-sleeved long hair, it becomes more refined and taller. Especially in those eyes, the pupils are a little high, and a light look at people can make people feel cold. Zhang Suizhu retracted his gaze, and in the aftermath, he saw the upper eyelid on his left near the end of his eye, with a little vermilion. He didn't have this mole originally. However, before he could take a closer look, they helped him through the mirror and went out the door. Someone was waiting outside, with a thin cloak in his hands. Seeing Zhang Suizhu approached, the man expertly wrapped the cloak for him. Zhang Suizhu was puzzled and frowned. He was dressed thicker than the people around him, so why did he wrap him up again? The next to him was keenly aware of his expression, and hurriedly said, "The wind is strong at night, and the prince can't bear it, so let's wear one more." The prince? Before Zhang Suizhu came back to his senses, he was taken down the steps and onto the steps that stopped in front of the house. He felt it as soon as he left the door. The wind was supposed to be warm, but it felt cold when it blew on him. This is different from being sick, it is more like a congenital deficiency and low immunity. Combined with the prince shouted by the just now, Zhang Suizhu felt a little uncomfortable. In the last years of the Jing dynasty, there was only one sick seedling that could be called the prince. It was His Royal Highness King Jing, whose name was erased from the history books, and only said that he was born deficiencies and died prematurely due to illness. Zhang Suizhu felt a little dizzy in his mind when he stepped up. If he follows the course of history, he will live for 3 to 5 years at most and die of illness. Even if he didn't die of illness, Bai Liang would destroy the scene, and he would never leave such a remnant of the previous dynasty. Zhang Suizhu's eyes were wide open, and he slowly leaned on the back of his chair. Anyone who suddenly knows that he has been alive in the past few years will not be too happy. Set his mind, he turned his head, looked at the who was following his steps, and decided to check with him again. What did someone call him just now? Qianshan, he called. Unexpectedly, hearing him shout like this, the next to him raised his head in surprise and looked at him in a daze. Zhang Suizhu's heart sighed. He knew that this reaction must be called the wrong one. In ancient times, those who served in front of the nobles were determined to have exquisite 7 orifices and a keen mind. I made such a big mistake as soon as I came here, I'm afraid. However, before he was finished worrying, the eunuch's face showed a flattered look that made him feel helpless. My lord, please tell me. His eyes gleamed, like a dog wagging its tail and rejoicing. You still call the minion name Meng Qianshan, forget it. Jiang Su is who? Well, he was worrying too much. The personal entourage of His Royal Highness King Jing didn't seem to have a bright mind. He turned away his eyes, and said calmly, how long has she brought to Prince Jing's mansion? Meng Qianshan didn't hear the temptation in his words at all, only when the prince was worried about delaying auspiciousness, he said in a head, don't worry, Prince, Madame Huo has just arrived. You are here now, the time is right. Seeing that he hadn't refuted the phrase Prince Jing's mansion, Jiang Suizhu confirmed. He has indeed become the short-lived ghost who doesn't write much in history books. But he frowned. Mrs. Huo? This new concubine, whose surname is Huo. Although he knew that the wild history was nothing but nonsense, he still couldn't help but remember the content of the student's paper. His legs were broken, and he was married to the mansion by King Jing, with the surname Huo. How could this newly entering concubine look like General Huo in history? However, Jiang Suizhu erased this idea immediately. What are you thinking about? The plot of the wild history, the TV series dare not act like this. At first glance, it is made up of grandstanding, it must be impossible to be true. Jiang Suizhu confirmed the guess in his heart and closed his mouth. It was Meng Qianshan next to him, chattering all the way with him. Jiang Suizhu gradually realized that this subordinate, who had little brains, must have been left out in the cold on weekdays. Today, by accidentally treating him with a friendly look, he started to show joy. It's okay to be silly. Hearing his rumors all the way, Jiang Suizhu's original heavy mood was somewhat relieved, and between the lines, he also got an overview of the situation in the palace. It's all here, let's take a step and take a step. He sighed inwardly. After walking for about a quarter of an hour, he stopped in front of a courtyard. A red lantern hung at the entrance of the courtyard, and under the light, there was a spot of firecracker fragments. Through the courtyard door, a sedan chair was faintly visible at the door of the main house. Many people waited in front of the gate, and when Jiang Suizhu was coming, they all knelt down and bowed. Jiang Suizhu was not accustomed to the feeling of everyone visiting, so he raised his hand and made them all stand up. Then a grandma with the appearance of a happy wife came up and said to Jiang Suizhu with a smile, "The prince is overjoyed. The lady is already waiting in the room, just waiting for the prince to lift her head." Jiang Suizhu responded. He knew the customs of the Jing dynasty, and the ceremony of accepting a concubine was much simpler than getting a wife. As soon as he lifted the small sedan chair into the mansion from the side door, the husband went to lift his hijab and drank a cup of wine. He nodded, and walked past everyone into the main house. He walks steadily and slowly, his clothes fluttering as he walks, and he looks cold and calm, with a superior demeanor. But only Jiang Suizhu knew how panicked he was right now. After all, he traveled to the Jing dynasty in a daze, and became a sick child who died soon. At this time, he had to go to the bridal chamber to face the poor girl who was married back by Jing Wangqiang. The girl is poor, and he is not much better. Thinking about this, he seemed to be steady, but in fact he stepped heavily up the stairs and pushed open the door. Inside the door, the red tent fluttered, and the candle flickered. The maids on both sides smiled and saluted him. Someone led him into the inner room. Amidst the beauty, he saw the man sitting in the hall. He is dressed in red, layered on top of each other, with a hijab embroidered with phoenix on his head. He is sitting in a wheelchair, sitting very upright, with his shoulders straight, like a long foldable gun. Yes, it's a gun. This man is tall, with broad shoulders, and has long legs that can hardly fit in a wheelchair. He is clearly a man. A disabled man who was married to King Jing. The Mrs. Huo I married, wouldn't it be Huo Wugui? Jiang Suizhu stopped. His eyes fell on the man's hands on his knees. The finger bones are distinct, and the meridians on the back of the hand are protruding. Although they only sit quietly on the knees, they seem to be able to twist a person's neck at any time, showing the spirit of killing. For some reason, Zhang Suizhu recalled a fragment from his student paper. After Ding Beiho Hua Wugui was taken prisoner, in order to humiliate him, the Queen Master of Nanjing broke his meridians and abolished his legs, and then married him to King Jing, who is famous for breaking his sleeves. He was in Jing. After bearing the burden of humiliation for 3 years, the palace tried every means to escape back to Bai Liang and heal his legs. After that, to avenge the revenge of the year, he cut off the head of King Jing himself and hung it on the city gate for 3 years after he destroyed the scene. That's why, the official history didn't mention a word to King Jing, even the name was erased. Zhang Suizhu's hands were shaking a little. If it was Hua Wuju. If it was Hua Wuju. After those 3 years, it was not King Jing who was beheaded by Hua Wuju, but Zhang Suizhu. He stared at the man in the wedding dress in front of him, trying to find a little trace from him, proving that he was not a man. But Zhang Suizhu's mind is a little empty. The prince, the prince. Meng Jianshan, who was following, saw that he had stopped in place, with a cold face, not knowing what he was thinking, and quickly reminded him in a low voice. Zhang Suizhu turned his head sideways. Seeing Meng Jianshan standing beside him, he cautiously whispered, "It's time to lift the hijab." "Yes, lift the hijab." "Haven't seen the face yet, who can be sure that it is Hua Wuju?" Zhang Suizhu stepped forward, comforting himself in his heart, and at the same time stretched out his hand calmly and uncovered the fluttering hijab. The red candle flickers. In the enchanting red, he met a pair of dark, icy eyes. The author has something to say. Zhang Suizhu lifted his hijab. "Hua Wuju, hi! Wife!" Zhang Suizhu stepped back involuntarily, and the red hijab fell to the ground. He felt his heart beating with shock, and even the blood in his ears was agitated. Just a look. With sharp eyebrows and low eyebrows, his eyes are particularly cold, with a bit of undisguised murderous and ruthlessness. In a trance, Zhang Suizhu seemed to see a dying beast. Although it was crawling in front of him, it seemed to pounce at any time, bite his throat, and die with him. There was a smell mixed with the sweet fragrance of red candles in the air, and it also smelled a bit of decay and cold in the cell. Now, without asking, he will know who this person is. Isn't it the beam of war who was crippled by the Queen of Nanjing, who would cut off his head in 3 years and let him dry on the wall? Zhang Suizhu pursed his lips, and suddenly wanted to apologize to his student. "Let him go, please, he wants to go." Zhang Suizhu stayed in place, and Meng Jianshan next to him was already going crazy. "What is the prince doing?" He lifted the hijab, but threw it away. At this time, he said nothing, staring at others coldly. Meng Jianshan glanced at Hua Wuji cautiously. He had only heard that the only son of Ding Beiho was a young hero who was hard to see in the world. Now it seems that this is true. After the emperor caught him back, he went down to the palace dungeon. People who have always been locked up there will be tortured to death if they haven't lived for 3 days. And this Madame Huo, but stayed in it for more than a month. His lips are now abnormally white, and there are still bruises on the corners of his lips, and there are some dried blood stains. Not to mention, he is really good looking, with profound features, and he is aggressive, looking like a strategizing general. Even if he was injured, he was not embarrassed. On the contrary, he felt a bit more decadent and vulnerable. Under the wedding gown, you can still see clear scars, the tip of the iceberg is exposed at the neckline, and the fiery red gown is dyed a not obvious dark red. At this time, even if Meng Jianshan knew that his elbow was about to turn to his master, he would inevitably be pitiful to this Madame Huo. He decided to take the risk and make a round of it. Thinking of this, Meng Jianshan bowed carefully and brought Hebuju for Zhang Suizhu. "The prince." He bowed sideways in Zhang Suizhu. Zhang Suizhu looked sideways, and saw 2 gold cups containing liquor impressively placed on the tray held by Meng Qianshan in his hand. He really needs to be overwhelmed. So, he picked up one of the cups, raised his head, and drank the wine in the cup. Meng Qianshan's eyes were about to stare out. "Hey! Lord! Happy wine, that is happy wine." Meng Qianshan looked at Zhang Suizhu in a panic, and then at Huo Wuju. The two of them looked indifferent like sculptures, and the other was cold and arrogant like a Hades, who forcibly blocked his throat when he was about to come. At this moment, he saw his master turn around and put the gold cup back in the tray. "Get down," he said. Meng Qianshan was taken aback. "Here, master." Seeing his master glanced at him lightly, the beating candle shining on the small mole at the corner of his eye. "All retreat." After a glass of wine, Zhang Suizhu finally calmed down. Until now, he could be absolutely sure that he had penetrated into the wild history described in the student's paper and became the unlucky lord who married Huo Wuju. After confirming this, he calmed down instead. The person who always wears himself will die early anyway. Being killed by Huo Wugui was a good thing for him. After all, disease cannot be controlled, but the relationship between people can be changed. Huo Wuju is an upright image in history. He defeated the world, but his uncle went to sit on the throne. After his uncle died, it was his uncle's son who inherited the throne, but he led the soldiers back to Yangguan alone and stayed there for life. I want to be a person of loyalty. If I don't humiliate him, and respect him a little bit, after 3 years, he will probably not kill himself. Only. He looked at Huo Wugui. Now he is the prince of Nanjing, and Huo Wu blames him in front of him as an enemy and a betrayal of the party. If he deliberately showed good intentions as soon as he came up, it would surely lead to suspicion, but it would be counterproductive. So. Zhang Suizhu took a slow breath and spoke coldly. "The smell of blood all over the body makes people sick." He sneered and said. Although he said that his family was not very happy since he was a child, his family education was quite strict, so he was polite since he was a child, and he has never said such things to anyone. Therefore, as soon as the words were spoken, they were somewhat unfamiliar and lacking in confidence. Fortunately, he has a cold voice and a condescending arrogance, so he can barely cover up and talk to bluff people. Huo Wuju did not say anything to him. He lowered his eyes and glanced lightly at the red hijab on the ground. Very cold, with innate arrogance. Obviously it was a look that would allow it to be dealt with, but it was awe-inspiring, making people afraid to step forward at all. Zhang Suizhu calmed his mind, and then spoke. As soon as he was pulled out of the prison, he was sent to this king? How can the emperor brother be the king so that he can still eat his mouth? He tried his best to say some harsh words, and the words were so awkward that his back was trembling a little. Huo Wuju's gaze moved away from the red head on the ground, and he swept across Zhang Suizhu lightly. I saw the man standing in the light with his back straight and his eyes cold. The fox eyes with the raised tails were quite squiggly under the red candle, and the red clothes lined the small red mole at the end of his eyes more and more. The tone was fierce, but awkwardly fierce, even with 2 points of apology and shame, as if he had never been fierce. He has fought against Nanjing many times, and naturally he has also heard the name of His Royal Highness King Jing. Sick rice seedlings, born of the enchanting concubine of disaster, with bad water in the stomach, are by no means a good bird. King Jing is a vicious man, and he has long been known for his reputation. As early as when he was 12 or 13 years old and was still a prince, there were always corpses dragged out of his palace, and the deaths were not very attractive. After he suddenly opened up and broke his sleeves, many male pets in the backyard asked him to play to death, and now there are not many alive. But now it seems actually exaggerated. But over there, Zhang Suizhu only thought about his own words, but didn't notice Huo Wujiao's fleeting look. He paused, then continued. I will find a doctor to show you tomorrow. Even if you are going to die, don't die with me. As he said, he turned around. After that, just stay honestly and make less trouble for this king. After speaking, Zhang Suizhu quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Should be fierce enough, right? It is necessary to maintain the cruelty to the enemy without actually hurting him, but also to find the cause of it and heal the wound for him. It's really hard. Naturally, he wanted to treat Huo Wujiao tonight. After all, he just came out of prison, and the later master would never give him a medical treatment. Although skin trauma is not fatal, it is not easy to delay. Moreover, Zhang Suizhu, as a modern man who had never seen any scenes, was a little surprised even if he smelled the smell of blood on Huo Wuju's body. But he knows, no. As the only prince in the dynasty, he still doesn't know who are in the mansion. That's why, he just wanted to quit all screens. As soon as someone from an enemy country came in, he rushed to heal the other party, which is naturally unreasonable. But if the two spend the night alone, and then ask for a doctor for each other tomorrow, the reason is enough. So, Zhang Suizhu looked around without a trace. This is the hall dedicated to weddings in the Fuzhong. Except for the red lacquered and gold-rimmed babu bed, there is only a small seat for people to lie on. There is no other place to sleep. The couch is exquisite and unique, with 4 corners carved, and the width is no more than 2 folds. Compared with furniture, it looks more like an ornament. Zhang Suizhu's eyes revealed a confession of life. He knew that he could only spend the night on this couch tonight. Before taking a step, he didn't forget to turn around and gave Huo Wugui a coldly. Go and lie down on the bed, stay away from me, don't let the smell of blood on you get to me. He said. He didn't know that this condescending and arrogant look, coupled with his overly delicate face, was somewhat intriguing under the swaying red candle. After saying this, Zhang Suizhu turned around and lay down on the couch. It's already all night to be there. He faced the wall, and did not find that after he lay down, Huo Wuju's eyes fell on his back. Looking at it coldly, it was as cold as a blade buried in the ice and snow of Yangguan. After a while, Huo Wuju retracted his gaze. He lowered his eyes, and his left hand, which had been resting on his knee, slowly turned over, spreading the palm of his hand. That hand was stained with blood. The red candle swayed, and what was held in the palm of his hand was a sharp wood chip. It was he broke off from the inner wall of the sedan chair on the way here. Originally, this piece of wood should have pierced King Jing's throat at any moment he could seize. But he glanced lightly at Zhang Suizhu's back. Just now, the moment he was about to kill the opponent, he met those eyes. Clear and clean, but very flustered, as if scared by myself. Huo Wuju closed his eyes. The wood chips had clearly been squeezed into flesh and blood, but at that moment there was no way to deal with it. He doesn't seem to have a hobby of bullying the weak. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes, put his hands on the sides of the wheelchair, exerted a little force, and then moved himself from the wheelchair to the bed. The pain in his whole body was pulled up, causing his muscles to tremble uncontrollably. He didn't notice it at all. With a slight movement of his hand, he hid the blood-stained wood chip under the bed by the slight noise of the cloth when he moved his body. His gaze swept across Zhang Suizhu and saw that he seemed to be lying uncomfortably, his back stiff, as if he was forcing himself to fall asleep. Laugh. Huo Wujiao withdrew his gaze indifferently. After Zhang Suizhu lay down, he closed his eyes tightly, and only waited to fall asleep quickly and get through the night. It's best to wake up the next day when he was in his apartment and was woken up by an alarm clock. However, even if he just wanted to sleep peacefully, Zhang Suizhu failed to do so. It's really a carved bed in all 4 places, not only looking at the person, but lying on it even more so. He can only be sideways, with a thin cloak over him, which can barely be a quilt. This sickly crooked body is beyond his expectations. The narrow seat made his back sore, even in the spring room, his hands and feet were cold. Throughout the night, he couldn't sleep at all, so he stayed up until the red candle in the room burned out, and the sky was getting bright outside the window. By the time he sat up early in the morning, his whole body was so painful that he almost fell apart, and his throat was also a little itchy, which made him want to cough. He squeezed his throat and coughed twice and rubbed his dizzy forehead. Outside the window, there are already many maids waiting under the corridor. Jiang Suizhu looked up and saw Meng Qianshan standing at the door with his hands in his arms. Presumably he wanted to wait for him to wake up and come in and wait for him. Never let him in. As soon as he came in, he and Huo Wuju didn't have the same bedtime, didn't they show up? Jiang Suizhu immediately made a decision in his heart. Got to run, run quickly. He glanced at Huo Wugui. On the other side of the bed, with an empty wheelchair, Huo Wuju lay motionless on his side, facing him. A little light came through the window, shining on his face, and the crow-like eyelashes cast a shadow. He is indeed very good looking. His facial contours are sharp, his features are profound, and the bridge of his nose is straight. With his eyes closed at this time, his fierce black eyes are covered by long eyelashes, and he looks heroic. Facing the sun, Jiang Suizhu saw that a small old scar crossed the tail of his left eyebrow, suddenly cutting off the sharp eyebrows. It was like a scratch that fell on a soldier, causing it to fall into the mortal dust, stained with a bit of blood. He slept soundly. Jiang Suizhu breathed a sigh of relief and carefully got up from the couch. Huo Wuju hasn't woken up yet, so it would be best. After all, I put my words so cruel last night, but hid next to me and slept for a night. At dawn today, I ran away in a desperate manner. This kind of faceless thing is more suitable to be done without knowing it. Thinking about this, Jiang Suizhu straightened his robe and stood up straight, seeming to be magnanimous, but actually walked out lightly. As the footsteps went away, the door made a sound of being opened, and then it was closed again. The only slight sound in the room also disappeared, leaving only an empty silence. Huo Wuju opened his eyes. Those gloomy eyes, awake and sharp, didn't look like they had just woken up. His eyes fell coldly on the couch under the window. Under the open window, the sunlight fell on it, and the dust flew under the light. There is no one on that couch. Even, it has been carefully sorted out. Just by looking at the awkwardly flattened folds above, it seems that the person is struggling to hide the traces of his sleep. Huo Wuju's gaze paused. He has always been extremely alert, and has good ears and eyes. Therefore, every move of King Jing last night did not escape his eyes. He watched him squeeze and lie down on the bird's-eyed couch, and then listened to him tossing about there, thinking that his movements were lightly tossing all night. Just now, listening to him as a thief, he tiptoed out. Unbelievable! Before coming here, Huo Wuju had expected what he would face in the Jing Palace. King Jing is a vicious and insidious person, cunning and hateful, and he is originally at odds with Emperor Jing. Emperor Jing looked like a reward, but in fact he used him to humiliate King Jing. King Jing couldn't help but hate him. His situation will only be more difficult than in the Sky Prison. But instead of this, King Jing did nothing, he avoided him, as if he were terrifying. Huo Wuju lowered his eyelashes involuntarily, and his eyes fell on his legs. People from Nanjing are indeed afraid of him. It was because of fear of him that he would abolish his meridians and break his legs. Even he has become a disabled person who can't stand up, they are still afraid. Just as yesterday, he was only taken out of prison, and most of the imperial forest troops were dispatched, and all the streets along the road were strictly enforced. The sedan chair was remodeled more rigidly than the prison car, as if he had the ability to fly out with wings. Huo Wuju had long known how much he had made them frightened before, but now their abuse of him will become even worse. As long as it falls in the hands of the enemy's fear will be transformed into a knife stabbed in him. Only when he reaches the point where there is only one breath left, they will be relieved. They are right to do so. After all, he Huo Wuju, as long as there is room to move, he will never sit still. But this King Jing. Huo Wuju frowned. He had never seen a person like King Jing, who was clearly afraid of him, and there were some ways to deal with him, but he didn't do anything. He didn't believe in Jing Wang Chunshan at all, but Jing Wang didn't seem to have any need to act on him. Huo Wuju closed his eyes. He had guessed many moves of the opponent as early as he was in jail, leaving himself plenty of backhands. He knew that something was bound to happen, but he never thought the accident he encountered would actually be King Jing. Seeing Zhang Suizhu push the door out by himself, Meng Qianshan, who was waiting at the door, was startled. He looked at the sky, hurriedly greeted him, and said, "Master, there is still more than an hour before the meeting, why don't you rest?" Zhang Suizhu closed the door. Da Chai? He knew it. The Jing dynasty did not have the rules of dynasty every day, but one dynasty for 5 days, which was called Da Chai. But he did not expect that he would run into it the day after he wore it. He nodded and spoke faintly, his voice a little dumb, "Wake up early, nothing happened." Meng Qianshan hurriedly responded, turned his head and ordered the people next to him to go to the prince's courtyard to prepare food, and he helped Zhang Suizhu and led him out of the courtyard. Zhang Suizhu stayed up all night. At this moment, when he was dizzy, he did not refuse, letting Meng Qianshan support him. Meng Qianshan glanced at him carefully as he walked. Good fellow. His eyes were dark blue, his face was pale, his footsteps were vacant, and there was uncontrollable fatigue in his eyes. This, Prince, was it very intense last night? Meng Qianshan took a look, then carefully withdrew his gaze. But he couldn't control his eyes, and couldn't help but glanced again at the second and third. He peeked too often, even Zhang Suizhu found out. As soon as Zhang Suizhu sat down on the footsteps at the gate of the courtyard, he saw Meng Qianshan looking at him again. Zhang Suizhu couldn't help frowning, and asked, "What's the matter?" Meng Qianshan hurriedly closed his gaze and said with a smile, "Nothing, nothing, just want to ask the prince, what do you want to use this morning?" Zhang Suizhu shook his head, "Whatever you want." Meng Qianshan hurriedly responded, and instructed the servants to lift up and walk towards Enyantang. Zhang Suizhu pondered for a moment, and then asked, "Meng Qianshan, Huo Wu, can you arrange the yard where Mrs. Huo will move?" Although his head was dazed, he still remembered his calculations last night. The place where they slept last night was the auditorium in the palace for weddings. Today, Huo Wuju will move to his residence. Once you have made up your mind not to provoke him, you must not treat him badly for these basic necessities. Meng Qianshan was dumbfounded. Ah! When will the prince ask about these trivial things in the mansion? Zhang Suizhu didn't wait for a moment to respond. He turned his head and saw Meng Qianshan go silly there. Meng Qianshan, he reminded. Meng Qianshan hurriedly replied, "Don't worry, the prince has already ordered you to go down." Zhang Suizhu paused, and then said, "He seems to be hurt badly. You will have to take a look later." "Good guy, I have to find a doctor for someone else." Meng Qianshan nodded again and again, "The minion will go find a doctor in a while and show it to Madame Huo." Zhang Suizhu gave a hum and said, "You have a snack." After speaking, he retracted his gaze, closed his eyes, and took a nap on his forehead. But he didn't notice that Meng Qianshan, who was following him, was stunned by his orders. He was already screaming in his heart. He was sent to serve the prince since he was in his early 10 years, and he has been with him for many years. When has he seen the prince take care of this? The Fuzhong is not a lady without her, even if she is spoiled, she has never seen the prince take such care. He hadn't forgotten that when the prince came last night, he was still cold and angry. Yesterday he threw his hijab again and drank heavy wine by himself. Just waiting for the eyes of others made his back sweat. But only one night, unexpectedly, I started to think of the lady in it like this. What else can teach people to change their attitudes so quickly? Even if he is just an eunuch, he knows a little bit. But I want to come. Just by looking at the prince's excessive indulgence/desire today, the lady's methods inside can give you a glimpse of one or two. Thinking of this, Meng Qianshan couldn't help but sigh. Unexpectedly, that crippled person, and such skills. The author has something to say. Jiangsu is who, backache and backache. I didn't sleep all night and my head exploded. Meng Qianshan, oh, Mrs. Huo, Niubi. Back to the door? Huo Wuju destroyed the kingdom of the queen, and the latter killed Huo Wuju's father. At this point, how can you say that this is Huo Wuju's family? He said something to return to the door, but the undisguised tone clearly wanted to find an excuse to get Huo Wuju ridiculed and humiliated. After 1,000 years of history books, Zhang Suizhu knew a little bit about this faint monarch. How stupid he is, this bad move that made Huo Wuju come back is definitely not something he can think of. Zhang Suizhu saw the eye contact between him and Pang Xiao. 9 times out of 10, it was Pang Xiao and the postmaster who went together. The latter wanted to vent Huo Wuju's anger, and Pang Xiao wanted to please him, so Pang Xiao came up with such an idea for him. The two of them hit it off right away, seeking benevolence and gaining benevolence, and each was happy, but in the end it was his Zhang Suizhu who suffered. Regardless of who is going to insult Huo Wuju, at Huo Wuju's place, he and Zhang Suizhu are in a nest with them. After the master had finished bullying, people felt refreshed, but Zhang Suizhu's head was recorded in this account. Zhang Shunheng didn't want life, he could do it, but he couldn't use his Zhang Suizhu's head as a bargaining chip. Zhang Suizhu gritted his teeth. He had to refuse for Huo Wugui, and had to come up with a reasonable reason. He paused, and his face that was so delicate that it was almost yin-yang showed 2 points of disgust and embarrassment. Brother Emperor, this is unnecessary. He lowered his eyes, his slender eyelashes blocked the emotions in his eyes, and he made a gesture of rejection just right. A handicapped person can hardly be considered elegant, and the emperor will be disgusted by. His tone was slow, and his disgust was clear. The words are beautiful, and it seems that every sentence is for the consideration of the posterity, but the people around him will know that he is embarrassed and said a few beautiful things. Naturally, how he said he was also a prince of a country, and he went to the palace with a prisoner of war to return. It was too funny and shameful to think about it. Many courtiers showed a somewhat gloating look on their faces. Then the lord became more energetic when he heard this. Why, I don't want to bring it out. My 5th brother, I only spent time with someone in the bridal chamber last night. Why is he so ruthless today? Hearing his weird tone, Zhang Suizhu inevitably became disgusted, but he had to continue acting. He paused. It seemed that he was extremely embarrassed because he had had a skin relationship with the other party. After a while, he lowered his voice and said, Brother Emperor, this is different. The latter laughed loudly, and there was a cheerful atmosphere in the whole court. Pang Xiao cleared his cough again. After the lord looked at him, he saw Pang Xiao blinking at him under his head. Later the idea will be. Long before the court, his uncle had told him that although he proposed to let Huo Wuju come back, he would humiliate Zhang Suizhu, but that's nothing to talk about. More importantly, he should do this. Bargaining chips in exchange for good things in Zhang Suizhu's hands. Although he was not interested in what good things Zhang Suizhu had in his hands, it was a happy thing to take away from him. Even now, he is no longer the poor prince who was ignored by the emperor and can only watch how the emperor pampers Zhang Suizhu. Even now, he is already the emperor. But his hobby has not changed. The latter cleared his throat, changed to a more comfortable sitting position, raised his leg and stepped on the cushion of the dragon chair. Well, since the 5th brother is reluctant and insists on Jinwu hiding Jiao, I will not force you. He stretched the tone and said with a smile. But, since the 5th brother wants to hide the beautiful woman, what he has to do in exchange, are you right? Zhang Suizhu frowned without a trace. Sure enough, he guessed right, the postmaster's detrimental trick was proposed by Pang Xiao. Since he coaxed the master to be happy, he would naturally not fail to get paid. If the remuneration was not given by the master, then Pang Shao definitely wanted to get it by himself. It's just, from what I see now, he's just an idle prince who leads a errand. What are they worthy of conspiracy? Zhang Suizhu paused, and tentatively said, Brother Emperor, please tell me. The master cleared his throat. I have thought about it. If I want to build an ancestral hall in the palace, I should still do it by the Ministry of Engineering and not the Ministry of Ritual. It just so happens that Luan Zheyi still begs me these few days, and wants her father to share the worries for you. Fifth brother, in any case, can't make the beauty sad, are you right? Zhang Suizhu jumped on the eyebrow peak. That's the case. When Nanjing arrived at Emperor Jingyu's dynasty, due to Pang Shao's reign, the corruption of the court had reached a peak. Since ancient times, officials have become corrupt, and the easiest way to do things is to build projects. And here, the biggest oil and water must be the construction of palaces. Precisely because of this, the postmaster was clamoring to build a new palace, and Pang Shao let him build it. Anyway, the palace is covered, and the money will flow from the treasury to Pang Shao's pocket. Now it seems that the repairs to the palace must have not been completely completed, so Pang Shao will stare at this beauty. But Zhang Suizhu didn't quite understand how such an obvious piece of fat fell into his hands. He was speechless for a while, and he patrolled the hall without a trace. There are those who have a lot of time to watch the show, and those who are cold and silent. There were even a few officials who looked nervous and looked straight at him. Under the turbulent dark tide, there are clear distinctions, as if there are two factions in the dark. Suddenly a bad guess arose in Zhang Suizhu's heart. Look at this situation. It seems that he also hides a little power in the court. This errand is what those people tried to put in his hands. After Pang Shao manipulated the Lord to say these words, he wanted to come, and he was also competing with him. In this case, the situation is much more complicated. At this time, he took a step back, and it was not just his own interests that hurt. Only. For one thing, he is now in the dark, and he doesn't know what is going on in the courtroom, and he doesn't even know who his subordinates are. Even if he takes over this job, I am afraid that something will happen. 2. Now before him, is a question of choosing one or the other. Either give up the hard-earned advantage of King Jing and offend all his colleagues, or bring Huo Wugui into the palace to humiliate him and offend Huo Wugui. Zhang Suizhu sighed. It was simply putting him on the fire. But when the two are compared, the head is still more important. On the dragon chair, the master is still urging him strangely, Fifth brother, why don't you speak? This beauty and beauty, you have to choose one. Zhang Suizhu raised his eyes. This time, the disgust and anger on his face were no longer pretended. What the emperor said is extremely true, the ministers really shouldn't overstep me. He opened his mouth and said slowly. He saw that the postmaster smiled more and more proudly. The sky was bright, and the shadows of the trees outside the window were whirling. The sun shines brightly through the tender green branches, spreading mottled light on the smooth dark floor tiles. The slender dust flies quietly in the light, making the light show a bit of yarn-like essence. A dazzling silence. Zhou Fu Doctor knelt on the ground, his back straightened, and a thin layer of cold sweat came out on his forehead. He stared with round eyes, struck his neck, and did not dare to move. In front of the pulsating blood vessels on his neck, there was a sharp, blood-stained piece of wood. The blood is not his, but he can feel how sharp this piece of wood can cut off his throat instantly and kill him. Madam! General! General! What on earth the general wants to ask, just ask. He trembled in a trembling voice. There was a low voice above his head. That was Huo Wuju in the wheelchair. He sat there, bent over, one arm lazily on his knee, and the other hand, holding the blood-stained wood. Strictly resisted Zhou's doctor's throat. What did he ask you to do? He tilted his head, lowered his eyes, and looked down at the kneeling person in front of him, and asked. Zhou Fu doctor said truthfully, tremblingly, the young one is here to heal you by the order of the father-in-law of Jian Shan. Huo Wuju said coldly, to be honest. Dr. Zhou's tears were about to fall, just tell the truth. Huo Wujiao looked at him up and down coolly. It does not seem to be fake, but it does not rule out the possibility of pretending. Just now, when this person came and said that he was the doctor in the house, Huo Wuju had a guess. Emperor Jing is an idiot, but King Jing is not. Emperor Jing catches him, just want to torture him for fun, but King Jing doesn't only have this purpose. If he does not move, he will definitely have a plan. And King Jing might want to get from him, either Liang Jun intelligence, or he wants to use him to fight against Emperor Jing. Although his performance yesterday did not match the rumors will not be groundless. Therefore, if King Jing wants to relax his vigilance and control himself again, then the best way is to take the life of a doctor and give him medicine. Huo Wuju looked at the doctor who was shaking like a sieve, his eyes cold and unmoved. Then open your mouth. He ordered lightly. The government doctor obeyed tremblingly. The next moment, a pill suddenly fell into his mouth, and before he could react, someone had pinched his jaw tightly, and suddenly lifted it up. The pill fell into his belly. The hospital doctor's pupils trembled, and immediately, he felt a severe burning pain rising from his stomach. In front of him, the handsome general slowly retracted the pieces of wood, and sat up on his knees. Those eyes are as dark as a deep pool, calm and unwavering, like the impermanence of life in hell. He leaned back on the back of the wheelchair. It was clear that he was sitting on an extremely simple wooden chair, and his overall bearing was like sitting on a tiger's skin in a king's tent. He looked down at Zhufu doctor and said, "This medicine can corrode the 5 internal organs within a moment. I still have the antidote in my hand, so let's talk about what they are sending you to do." Zhufu doctor cried bitterly. Little did not lie to you. The burning pain in his abdomen had already made him tremble with fright. Anxious and afraid, he awkwardly grabbed the medicine box left aside, and opened it to Huo Wugui with trembling. The little one really got the order to show you the hurt. These are all medicines. If you don't believe it, you can just use it on yourself and testify for you. As he said, he hurriedly poured out the contents of the medicine box, and was about to open one by one to Huo Wugui. Huo Wuju looked at him quietly. This time, he believed this man's words were true. Did he really come to show him the injury? Somehow, Zhang Sui's who under the red candle last night appeared in front of him. It was clearly a rabbit whose ears were so frightened that he had gone to the back of his head, but he wanted to pretend to be vicious. Also, give himself medicine, he may not have the guts yet. Huo Wuju quietly looked at the government doctor on the ground. After a while, he took out a vial from his arms and threw a dark brown pill on the ground. One is worth 3 months. You are not allowed to say a word about today's affairs. After March, you will come to me for medicine. Huo Wugui said. The Zhou doctor picked up the pill quickly and stuffed it into his mouth. Since it is hurt, get up and see. Huo Wuju spoke lightly, and glanced down at the small medicine bottle in his hand. There are only 2 medicines in his body. When he was in prison, the soldier who escorted him was the old part of his father's old friend Lu Yu, so water was released when he searched his belongings, allowing him to leave something to save his life. One of them blindly can stop the bleeding quickly when severely injured, but after swallowing, there will be severe pain in the 5 internal organs, and the pain will disappear in about half a moment. The other flavor is to boost energy and blood, usually marching in the snow, the most useful. He glanced at the government doctor who stumbled up from the ground with his tears, retracted his gaze, and quietly put the medicine back into his arms. The subordinates who came to pick up Huo Wuju and move to the yard came when the Zhou's doctor gave Huo Wuju medicine. When Huo Wuju came, there was only one person, and there was no dowry luggage to carry, so at this moment only 2 maids came here, and a tall and maidservant. The two maids should have been assigned to Huo Wuju to serve him. When they came in, their faces were not very good looking, and they looked down and looked like they didn't respond. Seeing Zhou's doctor administering medicine to Huo Wuju, one of the maids said, "Dr. Zhou, how long will it take to get better?" He didn't even look at Huo Wuju in his eyes, and he didn't even have a gift, as if he hadn't seen him. The Zhou Fu doctor bandaged Huo Wuju, and said, "The two girls wait a while, and it will be fine in a while." The maid gave a cry and turned around and said, "Then you are quicker, we are waiting outside." After speaking, a few people turned around and went out. They walked out of the house, but the door was not closed, it was just that way open. The maid who hadn't spoken just said, "It's really annoying, wait a while, it will be noon, and the sun will be on the road for a while." Another maid said, "No, it's bad luck." Hearing this, the maid laughed a few times and said, "Unlucky? What kind of bad luck is in the sun? It's bad luck to give us this errand. No? Who wants to serve the crippling of an enemy country? It's not that we are unlucky." The two of them did not lower their voices at all, as if they were not afraid of being heard by the people in the room. The crisp voice of the young girl clearly reached Zhou's doctor's ears. Zhou Fu doctor's legs began to shake. Others don't know, but he knows that he is sitting in a wheelchair in front of him, but he is a hell who kills without blinking an eye. Dr. Zhou Fu was so frightened that he sweated and raised his eyes cautiously to look at Huo Wuju. I saw him sitting in the same place, his eyes were not raised, and he didn't react at all, as if he hadn't heard anything. The daylight quietly fell on his side face. Perhaps the sun is too bright, and it always makes people feel that this motionless handicapped person in front of him should be an extremely proud person. Dr. Zhou did not dare to say much, he hurriedly retracted his gaze and bandaged his legs properly. Afterwards, the wound should not be touched with water. The medicine needs to be changed every 3 days. The younger one will report the truth to the prince. Zhou's doctor said. Huo Wuju had no words. The Zhou Fu doctor packed up the medicine box on his own and walked out. After a while, the two maids came into the room. They instructed the rough servant to push the wheelchair up, which was regarded as picking up Huo Wuju and sending him to his next residence. This wheelchair is not easy to push. The wheelchair was originally large and heavy, and because it was for Huo Wuju, it was just a tool for transporting prisoners. The wheelchair was extremely rough, and the two wheels on the chair were removed from the prison cart and reluctantly installed. From here to the backyard where the wives and concubines live, if you want to take a shortcut, you must go through the garden in the palace. The gardens in the south of the Yangtze River have always been one step at a time, and there are streams and ponds all around, for people to walk on, either small bridges or gravel paths. But these two maids were lazy and impatient in the sun, so they insisted on walking out of the garden. Even if the young man is strong, it is extremely laborious to push up the wheelchair. After walking for a while, I couldn't keep up with the two people. The two maids just kept going all the way, and turned around a moment later, only to find that Huo Wuju had fallen behind. They were initially resentful because they were assigned to serve Huo Wujiao, and saw that the master was silent from start to finish, not only a handicapped, but also a soft persimmon, so they became more and more reckless. As soon as one of them turned around, he pointed at Sang Huai and said, "Why is it so slow? Is it possible that you are still a lady, afraid that the embroidered shoes will not be dirty?" The boy pushing the wheelchair was simple and honest. He was so anxious that his forehead was sweaty when he heard this, and hurriedly explained, "Sister, don't blame it, it's really a bad road." Another said coldly, "Who said you? Don't hurry up to keep up." "Neither is he, there is no fifth person present." The young man didn't dare to speak, so he had to push his wheelchair with his head down. The pair of wheels were not securely installed, and they were extremely unstable. When he panicked, his hands were insecure, and the wheelchair suddenly crooked, and it was about to tip over to the ground. But seeing the person in the wheelchair who didn't say a word from beginning to end, gently raised his hand and pressed it on one armrest. The wheelchair stabilized. The young man hurriedly bowed to apologize to the master, but suddenly heard a lazy voice from ahead. "Noisy, what are you doing?" Xiao Si looked up and saw two people standing under the weeping willow by the pond in front, followed by a group of servants. One of them is dressed in Xingyi, with delicate features, and the end is as gentle as jade. The other was born extremely bright, clearly a man, but swaying, his robe turned out to be red. The two wives infuse Hong Yuan. Xiao Si hurriedly followed the two maids and said, "Mrs. Guan, Mrs. Suan." I saw the red-robed Mrs. Gu waved his hand, let them all get up, walked forward, and said lazily, "Who am I?" It was Mrs. Huo who entered the door newly yesterday. With that, he walked to Huo Wuju and stopped. Huo Wuju did not seem to have seen this person. "How old is Mrs. Huo this year, right?" he said. "How old is I will just call my brother in the future." As he said, he smiled and stood in front of Huo Wuju. There was a stance that Huo Wuju ignored him, and he wanted to stop here. Huo Wuju didn't lift his eyelids. The atmosphere was quite embarrassing for a while. The Mrs. Su in Xingyi next to him paused, stepped forward, and said, "Chong Yun, let's go." Gu Changjiun didn't appreciate it, and smiled slowly, "Su Du, don't let him. This new door enters, but doesn't say hello to the brothers, what kind of style is it?" Su Du glanced at Gu Changjiun and frowned. Seeing Gu Changjiun stretched out his hand, he was actually trying to pick Huo Wugui's chin. "He looks handsome, look up, let my brother see." His voice stopped abruptly. With his eyes down, Huo Wuju, like eyes growing on his forehead, suddenly raised his hand and pinched Gu Changjiun's wrist with precision, preventing his movement. In the next moment, he exerted force and twisted it fiercely. The bones make a fragile sound. Jiang Suizhu naturally didn't want to care. He used his head to assure that General Huoda was not the one who was jealous in the back house, he must have been the one who provoked him first. That being the case, why should he offend Huo Wugui because of this person's idleness? What's the use of crying? The woman Zido still knows about pulling hair, he was beaten, and if he had the ability, he would beat him back. Jiang Suizhu glanced at the maid indifferently, and said indifferently, "This king still has important business." After speaking, he had to bypass the maid and enter the courtyard. Unexpectedly, the maid actually stepped forward 2 steps and stopped him. The Lord is hurt badly." The doctor said, "Only a little bit, then the man will wring the lady's wrist off." "Isn't that just a little bit?" Jiang Suizhu raised his eyes impatiently and was about to speak, but he saw the expression of Meng Qianshan next to him. This little was stupid and innocent, all emotions were written on his face. At this moment, Meng Qianshan looked at him blankly, with a surprised expression, as if he had done something unreasonable. In front of him, the maid still stopped him with tears, as if she was not afraid of his anger at all. Jiang Suizhu remembered that when he walked through last night, a maid just hit the water basin and was so frightened that she was going to lose her life. The maid in front of her dared to do this, only because she was arrogant. Presumably the Mrs. Gu in their mouth is probably a concubine of the original owner. Jiang Suizhu gritted his teeth, really uncontrollable, and cursed the original owner from the bottom of his heart. "It's fine if you want to spoil a man, can you find a peace of mind?" He took a deep breath and persuaded himself from the bottom of his heart. "I've come all by myself, and if nothing happens, I will stay here for a few years. So, even if you hide, you will sooner or later see the people around the original owner, including his messy concubines." Jiang Suizhu smoothed himself in the bottom of his heart, while turning his head, said lightly to the maid, "I'll go and have a look at dinner." The maid immediately received half of her tears, smiled into tears, and bowed to him, and the Meng Qianshan beside her breathed a sigh of relief and smiled openly. Everyone was happy, but Zhang Suizhu was bitter. He turned around, quickened his pace, and plunged into the original owner's study. As soon as he entered the study, he shut out everyone else and refused to let anyone in. This afternoon, he took out his ability to verify and analyze historical data when he was doing academic work, and picked up all the papers and letters in the original master's study. Sure enough, although the original owner pretended to look like an idle prince, he actually had private dealings with many ministers in the DPRK. However, because Peng Shao is now covering the sky in the court and has a lot of party feathers, even if it can be seen that the original owner is working hard in the court, the results are still not satisfactory. He only won some stragglers. For Peng Shao, it is not at all into a climate. Presumably this is why Peng Shao has always disdained to deal with him. In addition, Zhang Suizhu also turned to the two wives in his backyard from the account book. One was Su Du, who was married by Lu Shui after Zhang Suizhu went south to Linen, the other was Gu Changjiun, who he bought from the brothel 2 years ago. Su Du was not favored, but he had a good relationship with Gu Changjiun, and the original owner was very favored by Gu Changjiun. Every few days, he would go to his room to rest. In addition, there are many wives and concubines in the middle of his mansion, some of them brought home by themselves, and some of them were sent by colleagues. However, in just a few years, there were only 2 people who died of illness and death, punishment and punishment. Zhang Suizhu frowned. He did not expect that the original owner was such a cruel person. The servants who want to come to the mansion are afraid of him, and there is a reason. The sun moved a little bit to the center of the sky, and another inch fell, and the setting sun slanted through the window paper, shining warmly on the room's melted gold. Meng Qianshan came to knock on the door and told Zhang Suizhu that it was time for dinner. Zhang Suizhu collected the letters in the room, then left the study, and sat on the walk that Meng Qianshan had already prepared. On the way to Mrs. Gu's yard, he had already figured out how to deal with it. The original owner is a broken sleeve, but he is not, and he will not do anything to deal with other people's concubines, although this other is now himself. This concubine surnamed Gu came out of the brothel, and it must have no influence. Therefore, he planned to let the other party cry when he arrived, and just keep a cold face, put on a look annoyed by crying, and walk away with a few words. After that, I took this as an excuse to pretend not to like the fight in the back house and neglect the opponent, even if the matter is exposed. He planned it, and made psychological preparations, just waiting for the other party to cry. But he didn't expect that he learned what the original owner had done, and walked into Gu Changjiun's yard and opened the door of his room. What he saw was such a scene. Gu Changjiun lay lazily on the inner couch, holding his bandaged wrist in one hand, rubbing it slowly. Beside him, Su Du is also there. Seeing Zhang Suizhu coming in, Su Du got up and saluted him with his fists. And the Mrs. Gu, who was rumored to be a vixen from the brothel, looked familiar but not at all flattery, stood up and smiled. Today, my subordinates tried to make excuses to see the Lord, but they suffered a lot. That person. General Huo, it's really ruthless to start. By passing the vast and exquisite garden, you can reach the back residence of the palace. The large and unique houses were divided into courtyards, where the concubines of the palace lived. Jingwang Mansion was originally the residence of the gentry of Linen, a wealthy and enemy country. The entire mansion occupies a very large area and is extremely luxurious and exquisite. The court fled here, and the tycoons confiscated a lot of property for fear that they would not be able to save their lives. Since then, this place has become Jingwangfu. King Jing is not like the tyrants who live in the same house for several generations and thrive, and the huge house is simply dissatisfied. Therefore, although there are many houses in the back houses, most of them are empty. In the corner, as night fell, a few remnants of lamps lit up in a courtyard that had been in disrepair for a long time. With a creak, the door was pushed open. The maid carried a food box and strode in after crossing the threshold. The main house is not big, and the objects in it may not have been cleaned for a long time. As soon as it comes in, there is dust all around, which is a little choking. She frowned in disgust, speeded up her pace, walked to the table in the room, and put the food container on the table again. The meal is here, let the Lord take care of it. Her voice was cold and icy, and the word jour was a bit of yin and yang, which was extremely ear-piercing in the quiet night. The person in the wheelchair in the room did not respond to her. The maid had noticed that she was not only a handicapped person, but also a mute. As long as others don't touch him, he won't react to any bullying. Nature is the best punching bag. This maid had only been in the Jing Palace for a few months, and finally got a chance to serve the master. Although several people in the house are masters, there are big differences. For example, Mrs. Su's place is not a good place to go. She had long wanted to find a way and tried every means to ask Mrs. Gu to serve in the courtyard, but she did not expect that she would be assigned to the disabled. What can you get from here? I just crippled myself and lived in broken houses with leaks. The maid was full of resentment, and when she saw the wheelchair, she felt unhappy. Seeing that the disabled did not speak as usual, she sneered and said, "You don't know, you don't know. As soon as you do this at noon," Mrs. Gu's maid went to the prince to file a complaint. The prince heard it and said immediately, "I'm going to Mrs. Gu's room tonight." Huo Wuju remained motionless. The maid's voice was a bit sharp, "Do you know who Mrs. Gu is? You hit the prince on the tip of your heart, and you will let you be the prince? Then the prince will punish you, and you will even afflict us. I am also unlucky. Just break the yard. On the first day, I ran into such a thing." After speaking, she gave a cold snort, turned around and went out. If you are disabled, you have to do it with others. It's really overwhelming. The door was slammed heavily. Huo Wuju slowly closed his eyes. At this time, his forehead was so hot that he was already burning because of the unhealed wound on his body. A layer of chaos gradually appeared in his mind, but he was sober again. He concealed all emotions back into the depths of his eyes. In those eyes, there was a wild beast, who was forced to use reason and put it into a narrow cage, and was rubbed with blood by the iron cage. He has only endured pain since he was a child, and has never been humiliated. He knows that the loser is a bandit, and he should be slaughtered by others. He also knows that he needs to stay in the Green Hills and try his best. As long as he keeps a sigh of relief, there will always be a day of blood debts. He knew that there was no pain that could not be endured, but he never knew that he wanted to kill a tiger without actually using a knife. Just let it get some injuries, lock it up, and sprinkle a handful of flies that can't escape or escape on his affected area. It will die naturally, little by little. No matter how powerful it is, it cannot resist. Jiang Suizhu stared at them blankly, and saw Gu Changjiun stepping forward to ask him to sit down, and then he asked, "Lord, what is Pang Xiao's action in the hall today?" Jiang Suizhu was dumbfounded by Gu Changjiun's question. He thought about many possibilities, but he didn't expect that this vixen is not a vixen, and that due marriage is not due marriage. These two people are actually the staff in the mansion raised by the original owner in the name of his wives and concubines. For a time, many things became clear. It turned out that the original owner's so-called broken sleeve was pretended to be. You don't have to think about it and know that by pretending to be seen by the posterity and Pang Xiao, you can conceal people's eyes and reduce their worries about themselves, and the so-called concubine rooms that died because of his cruelty must have been stuffed by others to test his eyeliner. So he died tragically in his hands. Jiang Suizhu admired the original owner for a while. Tolerant of humiliation and thoughtfulness, thinking that if it was him who sat on the throne, Jing Chao would not perish so fast. He slowly sat down in the middle chair while digesting the huge amount of information that came suddenly. For a moment, he considered the words and sentences, and said briefly, he borrowed the words of the emperor to ask the king for the right to repair the ancestral hall. After speaking, he picked up the cup of tea that Gu Changjiun had poured him on the table and took a sip. He had just turned over the materials in the study, and he had forgotten to drink water. At this moment, he sat here and felt dry. Jiang Suizhu drank 2 sips of tea, but the room was quiet, and neither of the two spoke. He put down his teacup and looked at them. I saw Su Du, who was sitting on the side, eagerly asked, although the repair of the ancestral temple is not a big deal, it was won by several adults from the Ministry of Rites. Now, it has been taken away by Pang Shao. He has a calm face and a calm expression. Just a few words make people feel like a spring breeze. Jiang Suizhu couldn't help but relax a little. Your Majesty asks for it, there is no other way. Next to him, Gu Changjiun opened his mouth and said, since he borrowed His Majesty's mouth, it is indeed difficult for the prince to refuse. It is a pity that the silver will fall into Pang Shao's hands again. Su Du said, there is still a chance from now on, so just wait. But the lords of the Ministry of Rites, can the prince comfort you? Gu Changjiun nodded, indeed. Those adults have done a lot of fighting for the prince this time. If they annoy them, the prince's dealings with them these days will become the handle of the prince in their hands. After speaking, the two of them turned sideways and looked at Jiang Suizhu. They speak straightforwardly, and their heads are eloquent, and they know at a glance that the news that the original owner gets on weekdays will be shared with these two people, and these two people are extremely trustworthy to him. But the premise is, they didn't realize that King Jing had been dropped by another person. Therefore, Jiang Suizhu was quite cautious. After carefully writing down what they said, together with the names of the ministers, he nodded and said concisely, this king knows, and today I have also informed Master Qi. The two nodded one after another. Then, Jiang Suizhu briefly told them about the remaining memorials in the court. Fortunately, the lord was a faint prince, and he didn't talk about anything useful in the early dynasty last time, so Jiang Suizhu didn't bother too much. The two naturally discussed with him. What they considered was what Pang Shao would do under the current situation, and what opportunity they would have to make trouble and profit from it. Jiang Suizhu gradually realized that these two people must be the brains of the original owner. After analyzing and inferring for him, it is up to him to make a decision. The original owner was weak, so when he opposed Pang Shao, his methods were not very glorious. For example, in the case of Xiu Zongmiao, the original owner's plan was to embezzle from the inside. The difference from Pang Shao is who the money falls on. Hands. Jiang Suizhu understood him. After all, the imperial court has reached such a point that it is useless to blindly maintain integrity and cleanliness. Jiang Suizhu listened carefully to the two of them talking, and wrote down useful information for future use when he fished in troubled waters. A little bit of time passed, and when they had finished discussing the matter, the kerosene had been burned for a little bit. Several people stopped. Jiang Suizhu said that he was a little thirsty, and then picked up the teacup and took 2 sips of tea. At this moment, Gu Changjiun spoke again. Lord, how do you feel about Hua Wugui? He asked. Jiang Suizhu was taken aback. How do you feel, do you still have to compete with him? He looked at Gu Changjiun, he wanted to talk, but he didn't speak for a while. Seeing Gu Changjiun rubbing his wrist, he chuckles. Lord, don't want to think about it. My subordinates discussed with Su Du today, only to feel that Hua Wuju's side, there are still some things that need to be done by the Lord. Jiang Suizhu was puzzled, tilted his head and motioned for him to continue. Su Du and Gu Changjiun exchanged glances. Gu Changjiun continued, in the last 2 years Pang Shao and the Emperor didn't give you anyone. However, all those people were dealt with by the master, but one didn't stay. Now, there are only 2 of us in the house, and both are the masters. I found it myself. Therefore, this time Pang Shao offered to the Emperor to give Hua Wuju to the master as a concubine, and he must have been tempted. Jiang Suizhu frowned, you mean? Gu Changjiun nodded. The Emperor does not care about it for the time being, but Pang Shao still has doubts about the identity of the master. The people he sent in before were all eyeliners, but this time Hua Wuju is different, he is neither the emperor nor Pang Shao's. People are born with outstanding looks, so Pang Shao will surely send someone to investigate secretly to see if the prince will spoil Hua Wugui. Zhang Su is who? Ah, let me spoil Hua Wugui to prove that I am a broken sleeve? Why didn't you just chop off my head and hand it over to Hua Wuju's hands? He immediately refused. This king is not favored by Hua Wugui, can it prove that this king is fake? This is wrong. But Su Du, who had been silent, spoke. He said, but if he is pampered several times, it can prove that the prince must have broken his sleeves. If not, it will not be long before Pang Shao and his party will send people in. If the prince still comes to kill one by one, how long will it be revealed? Gu Changjiun nodded, we too have a discussion, and we think this is the most appropriate. The prince doesn't need to worry, as long as we spend more time at Hua Wuju's place for the night. The implication is that it doesn't matter whether you have done anything to him or not. As long as Pang Shao knows physically, even if Zhang Suizhu is a man who hates it, as long as he looks good, he will barely sleep, that is enough. Su Du went on to say, it's not bad today. Chang Zhenggong clashed with Hua Wujiao. It is reasonable for the Lord to visit him today. For a time, two pairs of extremely serious eyes looked at Zhang Suizhu one after another. Zhang Suizhu looked at them and fell silent. He made a lot of preparations just to avoid sleeping with the concubine of the original owner. But he didn't expect that the concubines of the original owner would look at him eagerly and let him go to sleep with Hua Wugui.